Welcome to ePathshala PG courses on computer science. The course is about web technology and we will see about the module called Java networking part 2 which would discuss about how we make communication over the systems in the internet. So, the objective of this module is to understand how we make communication with web servers using the programming language called Java. We will learn about the two different classes called URL class and URL connection class. We will also discuss about how to retrieve information from servers or to send some information to servers. We will see simple programs to get understanding about this communication, and we will also understand little bit about the socket programming. So, now let us see how we make URL connections to the web server. URL, as we know that it stands for Uniform Resource Locator. It is a very perfect scheme used for uniquely identifying any kind of network resources over the internet. The basic form of a URL would be it starts with a protocol and you have a colon and then you have the site name or the host name and then the path name of the URL resource on the server. So, URL would be looking like if it is a HTTP protocol, it starts with the protocol name like HTTP : this is the host name, and then you have the path to the path information to the URL or the resource. And if it is an FTP protocol, it starts with FTP and you have the path to the specific file, and it can be a file protocol. So, it starts with file to identify any of the files within your system. So, this protocol may include files like HTTP, FTP, Gopher, News, Mail2 and so on. So, if you want to connect to a URL, earlier it is very hard to get connected to a URL or make communication to a web server. We have to manually parse out the host protocol path from the URL, and we have to create a socket to connect the host to the server, and we use the protocol to send the write request and interpret the response. So, but Java makes this everything easier and possible. So, it is all about learning the different classes like URL class, URL connection class and some of the classes that supports for socket programming. So, now we can see that how do we open a connection to a URL. So, in order to open a connection, first we need to import the package called java.net.star. So, within this package, as we know, we have a class called URL class. So, now the first step we need to create a URL object. So, you can see here you create an URL object by specifying the resource specification. It should be given as a string to get this URL created, URL object created. And to fetch the contents of the resource, we use the OpenStream method of URL, which would return an input stream. So, you can see here there is the URL object what we have created now is URL1. So, URL1 dot the method name is OpenStream that is available within this URL class. It is an instance method of the URL class. So, the URL object dot OpenStream which would return an input stream. So, you can see here it returns an input stream object like in1. Now, we can use this input stream with other streams that is available in Java to retrieve the contents. So, we can see some example programs how we do all these things. Now, we can see this is an example program to read a stream from a URL. Given a URL, you want to read a stream from a server. So, the first thing you need to import the package called java.net.star and you are going to make some of the IO classes. So, import the package java.io.star. So, then have a class, define a class, have a main method. Now, the first step you need to know is to create a URL object specifying the string specification of the URL. So, now we want to read the URL or read the contents of the URL that is available in google.co.in. So, the entire web information, the entire page information, web page information, that is the source, the source of this URL can be retrieved when you create an URL object. So, make use of the constructor of the URL class, specify the URL within this constructor, one of the parameter as a constructor to create an URL object. Now, with this URL object you use the method called OpenStream. This would return an input stream object as I have told in the previous slide. Now, nest this input stream class with the other stream classes to make a read. So, now what we have done is IN is the input stream object. This is nested with the input stream reader, which is now nested with the buffered reader. You get a buffered reader object called BIN. So, now declare a string called temp to read the string and print it, in order to read every string and print it. So, now you can see within this while loop, temp is a string that is equal to, this is the buffered reader object, bin is the buffered reader object what you have created. So, use the method called readLine method to read line by line of the source what you are reading from that web page. Now, print the string, that is the temp object, the string object called temp. So, now you can see the output looking like this. The entire, you can see that the entire HTML source information of the page google.co.in, that would be read, or you are actually retrieving the entire URL and you are printing in your screen. So, this is how you can read a stream using this URL class. Now, let us see, there is another class called URL connection class. This URL connection class is a general purpose class for accessing the attributes of a remote resource. So, URL is to access the resource and URL connection is to access the attributes of a remote resource. So, this URL class, URL connection class would also inspect the properties of the remote object before actually transporting it locally. So, these attributes are exposed by the HTTP protocol specification, and it only makes sense for URL object that are using this HTTP protocol. So, in order to access the attributes or to inspect the properties of the remote object, we need to go for an understanding of a class called URL connection class. Now, let us see what are the methods that are supported in the URL connection class. So, we have a method called get content length. So, this is, as I told you, URL connection class is to understand or get the properties of the URL. So, you can use methods, all methods are like get information. So, it is, the method would be like get content length. So, this get content length would return the size of the content. So, this would return the size in bytes of the content associated with the resource. So, if nothing is there, then this length would return -1. And there is a method called get content type. So, this returns the type of the content and that is found in the resource. So, this actually returns the MIME content type. So, it returns null if the content type is not available. And then there is a method called get date. This get date would return the time and the date of the response, and it is represented in milliseconds. You can see that the time would be represented in milliseconds. So, you can see here since January 1, this it gives the date. And there is another method called get expiration. This returns the expiration time and date of the resource, which would also be represented in terms of milliseconds since January 1, 1970. So, everything would be, this would return, this long is actually the value that is returned in milliseconds. So, if the expiration date is unavailable, then 0 would be returned when you are using the method called get expiration. Now, there is a subclass of this URL connection class called HTTP URL connection. This also provides support for HTTP connections. So, this class name is HTTP URL connection, and we can obtain the URL connection in the same way as you are doing for the base class or the super class called URL connection by calling a function called OpenConnection on an URL object. So, the syntax we will see in the coming slides. So, with the URL object you have a method called OpenConnection. So, when you call this OpenConnection method with the URL object, that returns an URL connection object, and with the same method would also be useful or would be used to return an HTTP URL connection object. Now, these are some of the methods we will use with the HTTP URL connection class. So, we have a method called getFollowRedirects. This method would return true if redirects are automatically followed, and it would return false otherwise. So, this is actually by default this getFollowRedirects would be true, it would return a true. And then there is a method called getRequest method. This would return a string that represents the type of the request that has been made to the URL. So, the default is a get method by which you can give a request to the URL, or it can be a post method. And there is a method called getResponseCode. This returns the HTTP response code. That is, -1 would be returned if no response code can be obtained. So, this also throws an exception called IO exception if the connection fails. And there is a method called getResponseMessage. This is associated with the response code. So, for every URL connection you make, there would be a response. Whether it is success or it is a failure or an error has happened, some positive integer associated. Normally you can see 103 error, 101 found error. So, the same way you will have a response code, and there is a message associated with the response code. That message can be obtained if you use a method called getResponseMessage. And there is a method called setFollowRedirects. This is for setting to be true or false. So, this is a boolean value, you can set it true when redirects are automatically followed, and if this is false, redirects are not automatically followed, you mean that it is not followed. So, by default redirects are automatically followed. And you can also set a request method using the method called setRequest method. So, set the method by which you make the HTTP request. Either it can be a get method by which you make a HTTP request, or it can be a post method by which you can make a HTTP request. So, this is invalid. If the value provided is invalid, then it returns, it throws an exception called protocol exception. So, these are some of the methods that are implemented in the subclass of the URL connection class called HTTP URL connection, which is also useful when you want to make HTTP connections between the systems. And now let us see how do we communicate with the web servers. So, here we now need to know more clear about the URL class. So, the class java.net.url that represents a uniform resource locator, and that would create a Java object that represents an URL. So, we know that use the constructor of the URL class to create an object of the URL class. So, you specify the name of the specification of the URL, and you get an URL object. And some of the methods that you will use with the URL objects are get host, get protocol, get path, get port, and then get reference ref. And there's in the java.net package you have a class, as I told you, you have a class called URL connection class that represents a communication link between the application and a URL. So, the constructor of the URL connection class looks like this. So, you can directly make new URL connection and create an object of the URL connection. So, CON is the object of this URL connection class. This URL connection object can also be obtained with the URL object. So, as I told you, you make use of an URL class to create constructor of the URL class to create an URL object. Use that URL object and use a method called OpenConnection, using which also you can create an URL connection object. So, URL connection either it can be created using the constructor of that class, or it can be created with the OpenConnection method of the URL class, and you can get an URL connection object. Now, once you get an URL connection object, you can directly open a stream for reading using the URL class. So, to get a OpenStream, we use a method called OpenStream Method that returns an input stream object. So, we know that URL object dot OpenStream would return an input stream. So, this stream opens a connection to the URL and returns an input stream for reading from that connection. And the shorthand of using this method will also be look like this. OpenConnection is actually giving us an URL connection object. So, instead of using an URL connection object, you can directly use the OpenConnection method dot get input stream, which will also return an input stream. So, you can also directly work. Use the OpenConnection method of the URL object dot get input stream would return an input stream for the URL to read the data from the URL. Now, connecting to a URL, we know that it is an OpenConnection method, URL's OpenConnection method, we use it. So, this is a simple syntax that explains about how we open a connection to a URL. So, first step, we need to create a URL object. So, we have created an URL object. The second step, instead of creating an URL connection object using the constructor, make use of this URL object and the OpenConnection method and create an URL connection object. So, once you have an URL connection object, now you can make use of the OpenStream method and then make a connection to the URL, open an input stream and then you can read the resource. Now, this is a simple example what is happening. So, now previously we have seen that you directly make use of the URL class to read a stream. Now, you are going to read from a URL connection. So, here you need to import the packages called java.net.star and java.io to work with IO classes and the net classes. Now, first step you create an URL object. The second step you create an URL connection object using the OpenConnection method of the URL class. So, use the URL object dot OpenConnection that returns an URL connection object. Now, use this URL connection object dot get input stream. So, this would return an input stream. So, in the earlier example, we had the OpenStream that returns an input stream. Now, this is an input stream associated with the URL connection class. So, use the URL connection object UC dot get input stream that returns an input stream to read from the URL connection. Now, nest this input stream with the input stream reader and with the buffered reader, get an object called BR. Now, use the BR in a while loop to read the lines of strings and print it on the screen. So, we use br.readLine to read the information line by line and print it on the screen. So, this is an example to explain how we read from a URL connection. So, the output is looking like this. We can see here the same example, but the different the previous example was using an URL class. Now, we are going to read from an URL connection. Specifying the same URL, you can see here the URL content is actually retrieved. Now, this is an example for testing the other methods what we have now seen in the previous slides in the URL connection class. So, here you can see that you import the net package, you import the IO package and you are also going to make use of the date classes. Why? Because you have get date, get modified date methods that are specified in the URL connection class. So, also import the package called java.util.date. So, now the first step you need to create an URL object. This is actually commented this step. So, please leave this line. The next line you create an URL object. This is the first line you are trying to do, create an URL object. The next step, use the OpenConnection method with the URL object and create an URL connection object. Now, using the URL connection object, you can test some of the instance methods that are specified in the URL connection class. So, we have a method as we have seen earlier, we have a method called getDate. So, use the URL connection object yc.getDate that returns a date. So, you need the util package to be imported to work with dates. So, if d equal to 0, that it prints no date information, else it prints you create this new date object and then you print. Now, it also prints the content type. You can print the content type using the method called getContentType. So, the URL connection object yc.getContentType would print the type of the MIME type of the content. And the third method we are testing is the getExpiration of the URL page, the web page. So, getExpiration. So, this is also a date. We try to print the expiration date of the URL resource. And the next one is getLastModified. So, when the page is last modified, there would be a date associated with the resource when it was last modified. So, you can use a method called getLastModified and print, that is also a date. So, you need to convert that object, long object. This method returns every method, getDate, getExpiration date or getLastModified. Everything returns a long integer. So, you need to convert that into a date. So, convert it by creating a date object, new date, and then print it. So, that's where you can print a date and you can see that it is a date. And then there is a method called getContentLength. So, it would be represented in bytes, the size would be given in bytes. So, if there is no content, that length would be -1, negative. So, you can print the content length if it is available with the length len, the attribute name is length. So, if length is not equal to 0, what does it mean if length not equal to 0? There is some content in the with the resource. So, you want to read it. So, how do we read it? You have already created an URL object, you have already created an URL connection object. Now, use an input stream. You want to need an input stream to read the data information. So, use with the URL connection object, use the method called getInputStream that returns an input stream. So, when you get an input stream, you can either make it with nest it with a buffered reader class to read line by line, or you can directly read in bytes. So, you can use input.read method and that would read not in bytes, that would read in characters. So, you can read character by character and print it on the screen. So, the output is like this. So, we try to print the date, get date, and then we try to print the content type. You can see text bar HTML, the character set, everything is given, and then we try to print the expiration information which is not available, and no last modified information is also not available. Content length is unavailable and the entire page is actually printed. So, the content of the page is printed. So, now let us see about how do we make this URL connections for sending information to a web server. So, for sending information in the browser, you will have some text fields or other GUI components where the user can enter some information, and the browser can write this information to the URL, and on the server side you will have a script. So, before we have not seen about servlets. So, we can see that in the server side you can have a CGI script running that would process this request and would return a response to the client. So, here this web server can receive information from clients using either a get method or a post method. There are two kinds of request type called get or post. So, if it is a post method, then you can see that within the form, when you create a form, there is an attribute called method for which you would have given a value called post. So, which means that the entire information that you want to pass it would be attached to the header and that would be sent to the server, and there would be an appropriate CGI script which would process this information and produce a response as HTML page back to the client. And when we see that CGI scripts would be written, can be written in C, Perl, or can be a shell script, but we can also write script instead of going for CGI scripts. We can also write scripts with servlets. We will see that how to do servlets later in the codes. And there is another way, as I told you, you can send information to CGI scripts using a get method. When you are using a get request method, the whatever information you want to pass it would be attached with to the end of the URL. So, you can see an URL normally that would be separated by a question mark. So, The entire URL information would be till this script, and after this question mark, the parameters that you want to pass it to the server, that would be attached along with the URL. So, if your request type is a GET method, then the information what you want to pass from the client to the server would be attached along with the URL, which is not a secure communication. So, you can use a POST method where the information would be added to the page, and that would be header, and that would be sent to the server. So, now when this parameters are attached, we can separate the parameters. How the parameters are separated? It is separated using an ampersand symbol, and this parameters would be encoded in order to avoid misinterpretation. So, normally it uses an URL encoding like this. If you have a space in the parameters, then that would be replaced with a plus symbol, and if there are any non-alphanumeric characters, then that would be replaced by a percentage symbol followed by the hexadecimal code of the character. So, supposing this is the information you want to send it to the server, and it is attached to the URL. Mastering C++ is that attached to the URL. So, there are two parameters. So, we can see that mastering is the after this question mark we will have mastering, then this space would be replaced by a plus, and C would be sent, C would be had as it is, and there are non-alphanumeric characters like plus plus. So, these are replaced by a percentage symbol followed by its hexadecimal code of the character. So, this is actually this method of sending information would not be advisable. Why? Because this would not support for long parameter string. So, when your information that has to be passed is more, you have to use the method called POST method instead of using the GET method, and even it is not secure. And in order to write information through the URL connection, you have certain steps to follow. How do you write information to the server? The previous example explains that how to read information from the URL. Now, you want to write some information to the URL connection. So, the first step, you need to create a URL connection object, and you have to set the properties of connection as set do output as true for sending information to the server. And you can now make a connection by having the connection URL connection object as con.connect. And these are some of the methods by which you can get the header information, and in order to send it you need to get an output stream by which you can pass the information and write it to the other end. And this is an example that explains about how do you write to a URL connection. So, as I told you, you want to write a string in a reverse order to the other end. So, you make an encoding using the URL encoder, which has to be encoded in the UTF-8 format, that is the MIND format which would be accepted. And so, once you have a string to reverse, this is a string you want to write it, you create an URL object. Next, you create an URL connection object using the OpenConnection method. You have to set the do output, this is the method using which you write, you make it as true, using which you can write to the other end, you want to write to the URL connection. Now, use the method called get output stream, nest it with the print writer class and get an output object. Now, you can use this output object to write the string, and this is actually to read it. So, this we have already seen how to read it, get an input stream and read it from the URL connection. So, there are some more things about sockets which we would discuss in the next module. So, the summary of this module, we have actually seen that how communications can be made with the web servers using the classes called URL and URL connection in Java, and we have also discussed about how to retrieve information and to send information to servers with a few programming examples. And we have seen that there are two kinds of methods like get method and post method by which you can send information to the or make URL connections to the servers. Thank you.